Hi, I'm Lama Palden, happy to be with you this way in virtual reality and happy to share with you some of my thoughts about my beloved teacher, Kalu Rinpoche. I met Kalu Rinpoche in 1977 and became his disciple. Shortly thereafter, I went to Asia to study with him. Kalu Rinpoche was one of the great yogis, one of the great masters of Vajrayana Buddhism in the 20th century, and was the first person to establish the Monlam outside of Tibet. Kalu Rinpoche was an emanation of the great 19th century master Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Tai, who was one of the three founders of the Rimay movement. Kalu Rinpoche trained in Jamgon Kongtrul's retreat center at Sitrul Rinpoche's monastery Palpung in Tibet. Kalu Rinpoche did 2 3-year retreats there and then became the 3-year retreat master. Following this time, he, for 13 years, meditated in caves in the mountains on his own. His great love and inspiration was to provide retreats for the Tibetans, Bhutanese, Sikkimese, all the Himalayan peoples, and for eventually people all over the world. When the Tibetans came out of Tibetan 59, he was the first person after that to have a retreat center in India, and monks came from all the different Vajrayana lineages to study with him. He welcomed them with open arms. His best friends were also from the various Vajrayana lineages, people like Dejin Rinpoche, the great Sakya master, who was the only person he really let come into our 3-year retreat to teach us, and then the great Dzogchen masters, Chacho Rinpoche and Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche were very close friends of his. Before Kalu Rinpoche came out of Tibet, he was already teaching lamas from all the various lineages. He was invited to Lhasa to give teachings to the Dalai Lama and all the top geshes in the early 1950s. So Kalu Rinpoche's great love and inspiration was retreat practice, and he became the first Lama to establish 3-year retreats around the world as well, and the first person to authorize Westerners as Lamas, men and women equally. This was quite shocking to some of the Tibetans, but nobody could really criticize him, or nobody did criticize him because he was so highly respected. And eventually many of them followed suit. Rinpoche was also interested not only in all the Vajrayana lineages, but in all the world religious traditions. And for example, he told me that in 1930 he read the Bible in translation. And the first thing he did in 1972 upon going to the West was to pay his respects in Jerusalem and to go and have a private meeting with the Pope to pay his respects there. And interestingly enough, many Catholic priests came to study with him when he was in India or other parts of the world. I witnessed this on various occasions. One time when a group of priests came to Sonada, his monastery in Darjeeling, to take some teachings, when they came in after they were seated, he pulled a rosary out of the little drawer in front of himself to show them. An extraordinary thing about Rinpoche was his incredible kindness and love, just welcoming all of us with open arms. I think he believed in us more than we really even believed in ourselves, at least for some of us. And I was deeply surprised and shocked when, before I went into 3-year retreat and he was talking to us, the group, and he said that he wanted to give us all the Karma Kagyu as well as the Shampa lineage empowerments and teachings, and he wanted us to do all those practices in retreat in order that we would be able to be future lineage holders. So Rinpoche gave us everything, all the inner and outer teachings of the Dharma. As I mentioned, we didn't look like we had a lot of promise, but as an illustration of Rinpoche's confidence and joy in his Western students, right before I went into retreat in Salt Spring Island, one of his monks from Tibet, Palpung Umze, had just recently escaped Tibet and made his way to Canada to see Rinpoche. Rinpoche and I were hanging out in his room talking, and the Palpung Umze, this Tibetan monk, came in, and Rinpoche jumped up from his seat, ran to the window, and pointed out where I was going to be doing retreat. Rinpoche was so excited, he was jumping up and down about this. The years I was fortunate to study with him, I never went on pilgrimage. It felt like being with Rinpoche was being with the sunshine. One of the other things I wanted to share with you was that in all the talks Rinpoche gave publicly in the last few years of his life, he always emphasized that each and every religion at its core is the essence of awakened mind, and that these religions sprung from awakened mind that wants to communicate liberation and love and freedom to all sentient beings. So he deeply respected all religious traditions as well as all the Vajrayana traditions in Tibet and all Buddhist traditions, and really felt that their core, their essence, was coming from awakened mind.
I met Kalu Rinpoche in 1971 and stayed in Sonada for about 3 months with him. And so this was pretty early on. And it was when Richard Baldwin and Susan Baldwin were there. And he's now Lama Pema Jamso under Chaktutuku. And then also Uli Nidal was there with his wife Hannah, and Ken MacLeod was there. So a lot of people that went on to really practice the Dharma during their lifetime. So we would go every afternoon at 2 in the afternoon to down to the Gompa. We were staying up in a house, about maybe a half-hour walk. And Kalu Rinpoche taught on the 4 thoughts that turn the mind to the Dharma. And we were getting Nundro instructions, essentially. And he had a wonderful, really funny way of using his cat as his teaching tool. He had 2 cats, and so like he'd put a cookie on the cat's head, or something like a little snack for the cat on the cat's head, and then the cat would be going like this, trying to get the cookie off his head, and he'd say, "This is like samsara. You have the jewel of enlightenment within you, but you can't see it. You can't find it." And then he put like a bag over the cat's head, and he said, yeah, it's like that, where samsara is blind and the clarity's right around you, but you're covered with ignorance, and the cat would be trying to get out of the bag. So it was really quite amazing how he taught, and he taught in such it was very traditional. We were 6 weeks just on the 4 thoughts: precious human body, impermanence, karma, and suffering. And so really kind of drilling it into us in the whole traditional way of all the different kinds of examples and so on. And then when he came to America, we had a small Dharma center on Vashon Island off the coast of Seattle and the Puget Sound, and he came there too. And so we arranged a whole, like an Indian dinner where we invited a lot of people. We made chapatis for something like 200 people. And then he gave a talk in something like an auditorium for a camp, a summer camp, and it was winter, so it was pretty chilly. And so he's sitting there, and he's teaching Westerners, non-Buddhist Westerners, in a completely traditional Tibetan way. One interesting thing that happened with him was my older daughter she was pretty young, not walking, like maybe 8 or 9 months. And so I had her take refuge, and kind of held her up and brought her down for prostration. And he gave her the name Dorji Khandro. And so life went on, and about probably 16 years later, we were in New York, and we lived outside the city here for 7 years. And I heard that Kalu Rinpoche was at Lama Norla's place and teaching, and so we went up there, and he was giving an empowerment. And so you had to take refuge to take the empowerment, and I'd forgotten that she had taken refuge as a baby. And so she went through the line, and it was one of those things where it's just a stack of names, and so then she got her name, and I said, what's your name? And she said, Dorje Khandro. The preciousness of Kalu Rinpoche is how steeped he was in the actual tradition, how much retreat he had done, and to be able to be with a yogi with that level of experience, having had it in Tibet before the Chinese invasion, the depth of his knowledge, the vastness of his knowledge and his practice was something very precious, and anyone who met him knew it. And he looked really amazing. The shape of his head, and he was so thin, and his very compassionate eyes. So he sort of looked how you think a Tibetan Lama should look, this sort of classic yogi Lama. He embodied it, and so we were very lucky to have that contact with him. It wasn't miracles or things like that, but it was just a sense of the genuineness and his emphasis on compassion and generosity. And he really taught compassion a lot. And that's a powerful teaching. I mean, really, what else is important besides that? I think what the teaching that touched me the most that I received from Kalu Rinpoche was about the precious human body. I'd never heard that teaching before. And the idea, first of all, that just to be born human was rare. I never even thought about that particularly. And then when he went through all the examples of how rare it is and all the 18 different causes and freedoms for that and so on, that was very impactful to me. I was probably like 23 at the time. And also impermanence and talking directly about death. I'm from New Hampshire, and you don't talk about death. My mother was 99 almost when she passed away, and I'd try to bring up death with her, and she'd say, "Oh, honey, that's not a very cheerful subject." So yeah, to have somebody talk about death at a young age and impermanence, and then saying things like, "You are going to die, and you don't know when, and you don't know how, but it's going to happen," and it was awakening. It had the effect it was supposed to have, which was turn your mind to the Dharma.
So this evening I'm going to be talking to you about Kalu Rinpoche, because it's his 25th anniversary, and it's an opportunity to think about him and remember him. So I'm very happy to be doing this and to be remembering him. One of the first things that happened to me was that Kalu Rinpoche was coming to Dalhousie to give the Damngakdo series of transmissions for 3 months. So I was totally new. I just read a few books on Buddhism and tried a bit of meditation, and I hadn't the faintest idea what any of this was. We would be about 100 people squeezed into a room this size. No, it was a bigger room, but it was like there was hardly any room to sit, and we had to sit from 8 in the morning till about 6 at night, all squashed together, listening to Kalu Rinpoche just going, and then every now and then we'd all come near to the front and he'd hit us all over the head with some sacred object. And of course you get quite sleepy. And one afternoon, well, I think it was a series of afternoons, somebody was squirting a water pistol into the monks' faces around the front. It took us a few days to realise it was Kalu Rinpoche himself. He always looked so frail and so holy, and he had this kind of really wry sense of humour that was kind of, that's a demonstration of it. Of course, you're sitting there all day, you don't know anything about Buddhism, you just feel this presence of this. I remember thinking, he's such a small man for such a big presence, because he always looked so frail, even though he wasn't that old then, actually. He couldn't have been, he must have been in his 50s, but he looked ancient. And I remember him saying to us one evening, he would invite the Westerners in the evening. After such a long day, he would invite Westerners in the evening to give them a special teaching. Tenzin Palmo was there at the time, and a number of other nuns, English nuns, or who became nuns later. And he invited us into his room, and then he said this extraordinary thing. He said, when you think of your home, does your mind go to your home? Does your home come to you? And I was really, the question really woke me up. And I spent some time also at his monastery in Sonada. I arrived in Sonada, and this was all happening in about 1969, 1970, 71. And a few years after that, I arrived at his monastery, and I wanted to go. I just wanted to meditate. I want to go off to the top of the hill and meditate. And he said, "Well, I'll do a divination for you. I'll tell you tomorrow." And then the next day he said, "No, that would be too dangerous. The people around here are not, it's not safe." So he put me in the nuns' woodshed. So the nuns had to get all the wood out of the woodshed. Put me into the. This may be before I learnt Tibetan, but I went and asked him a question about the kirin, the development stage, because he'd given us all this Chenrezi practice, this Avalokiteshvara practice, and I was really, really puzzled by it. And I asked him, well, if you're thinking that you've got Avalokiteshvara on the top of your head, then you're here, down here, and you've got Avalokiteshvara on the crown of your head, but how are you seeing it? Because your eyes are down here. I was really having difficulty with it. And then I remember him very kindly looking at me and saying, "It's both your mind." So I came in one evening and sat down in front of Kalu Rinpoche, and Kalu Rinpoche was ignoring me totally. He was talking to other people, he was laughing, smiling, but he never looked at me once. So of course I got bored. And I thought, why am I sitting here? I want to go and do my practice, and this is just boring. So I decided I'd get up and leave. And at that very moment, Kalu Rinpoche turned to me and said, "Thank you." And I really took that to heart. It was his sense of humour, more than anything, that I'm left with, though. And it's something very, when I think of him, even as I'm talking now, I sense him there just with this wry smile, like I always think when I reach enlightenment, I look, and there will be Kalu Rinpoche sitting there with this smile on his face, like, it took you a long time, didn't it? What's been holding you up? I've been here all the time watching you, and at last you've got it. That kind of a smile, True sense of space and timelessness and humour. And he had, when we were in Sonodas, sometimes in the evening, if I was visiting, and for some reason, not just hanging out, but and there'd be other people sitting around talking, and he'd be teasing them. He was a huge tease. And one time he said to me, there was this old Lama there, and he said, "Oh, I'm giving you this Lama. You can do with him what you like. You can take him back to the West with you if you like." It's just an odd thing to say. And then he looked at my look of bemusement, and he says to me, "You Westerners, you like old things, don't you?" I noticed that. I was in the West. Yeah, you like old things. Yeah. And he'd say quite outrageous things too, actually. But things you didn't really believe he could be saying, I remember one evening he was just joking about who he would put in retreat with each other, and it was all couples, an odd assortment of various characters among the Westerners and the Tibetans. Really quite a very Tibetan sense of humour. Quite a lot of sexual innuendo. They're really into that. Even the monks and nuns. The nuns, I noticed, they used to do this, and they were so outrageous because in some way the whole idea of it was just hilarious for them, because they were living in they especially my nun friends, they just didn't have any idea about sex at all, some of them. So they just thought the whole idea was hilarious. Quite bawdy in this sense of humour. Kalu Rinpoche is of the same kind of sense of humour. Well, one of the things that we always noticed about Kalu Rinpoche was that he did seem to know what was going on in our minds. And there's a number of stories I could tell you of that. One of them was when I was staying in Sonoda, and I was living with the nuns, busily doing as much practice as I could and doing my ngondro. And I remember coming down the hill, and I was thinking about how other people had given Kalu Rinpoche a lot of offerings, and that he was able to do a lot of good things with these offerings, and I was very impressed by that, and I wanted to give him a big offering so that I could be part of that rather than a rather stingy offering. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, you see, if I had better karma, I would have more money, and then I would be able to make bigger offerings. So, it's all about karma, and it's just, I never thought that. It's a thought that never crossed my mind before. But just that afternoon I was thinking that, and then we sat for the afternoon teaching, and then right at the end of the teachings, Kalu Rinpoche, apropos to nothing at all, just said to me, very directly, he said, oh no, maybe it wasn't to me, it was about me. He said, and if Sonamplachi, which was my name then, if Sonamplachi had a lot of money, she wouldn't find any time to do her meditation practice. It was very odd. It was like, yeah. Just, but that sort of thing did happen a lot around Kalu Rinpoche. The other thing that I've noticed about Kalu Rinpoche over the years is that people dream of him. He's the Lama I have dreamt most of. He's appeared in my dreams more than anybody. And very clear dreams, very significant dreams, more than any other Lama. And people who just see his picture often dream of him. So I think of him as the Lama who appears in people's dreams, because it's yeah, it's quite marked. Yeah, there's one in particular that I do remember, which was, you know, you've heard of the whispered lineage. Well, in one dream, he did actually speak to me down a tube.
Mm.
He actually spoke to me down a tube, and in the dream he said, in Tibetan it was, Tu yi yene, sen ma yenwa, chiwa pong. And I still remember it, which means Tuk is honorific for mind and Sem is ordinary for mind. So the inseparability of, you know, the Tuk, the Guru's mind, and your mind, don't be distracted from that. Sem ma yenwa, and give up questions. In the mornings, the Sangha of monks and nuns would gather and be offered morning tea, and sometimes, you know, maybe some bread and biscuits or something like that. So, as we recited our morning prayers, so I was sitting there one time with the nuns, you know, reciting our morning prayers, and suddenly became aware, somebody pointed out, that actually Kalu Rinpoche was just a few feet behind us and was actually prostrating to us. He was so frail at the time, and you know, his attendant was standing there holding his things, his bags and his things, as he was prostrating again and again and again. He just kept prostrating to the whole Sangha. And you know, the other nun said, because I just wanted to jump up and get out of the way. I didn't want him prostrating to, you know, because I was right in front of him. He said, sit still, you know, don't be so egocentric. Just sit still, you know, keep your discipline, you know. And of course, it was Kalu Rinpoche who was actually offering that day. He was offering the tea to us all, and you know, he was making prostrations over and over again. You know, it was one of the most touching things I ever saw. I think, to see him demonstrating to us how to relate to the Sangha, really.
Mm.
And when the Karmapa came to Sonoda, and the Karmapa was passing through, and the generosity that Kalu Rinpoche demonstrated, like he'd spent months and months preparing things, even with his own, you know, himself sewing. He was he shook like that, you know, so that even when he was writing, you know, his writing had this vibration in it. And when you saw him sewing, you know, he'd sort of put the needle through and put it round. And I remember once watching him putting the needle in, pulling it through, and then it coming out at the end, so he had to start again, you know. And he was just so, I mean, it's just like completely undisturbed, you know, no frustration, just as it was. It was really tremendously impressive. And then they come up at, you know, he was preparing all these bales of cutters and bales of brocade and bales of incense, you know, the monks were carrying them in on their shoulders, and absolutely the best possible food was being served. It was like really no expense was spared to honour the Karmapa. Again, it was demonstrating this idea of abundance and of generosity and accumulating punya, and very important Lama for our time. He was the first Lama to set up 3-year retreat centres here in the West. And he had that idea really quite quickly. I remember in Sonoda when he started talking about doing that. From that followed this idea of well, in fact, he'd done that in Tibet, because in Tibet there were a lot of monasteries which had become, in a way, a bit disconnected from the tradition, and the monks didn't really have much of a training, and so he would actually introduce this idea of the three-year retreat in monasteries all over Tibet before he left. So he's a very significant figure. I feel very blessed to have had such a strong connection with him.
I would like to extend my warm greetings to all of you gathered at the Rimay Monlam. I'm Lama Drukyu, and I've been asked to say a few words about Kalu Rinpoche, my teacher, his legacy and his impact. I think it's undeniable the critical role Kalu Rinpoche's activity has played in the development of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in the West. Just as we throw a stone in a pond and the waves spread out, of course it's difficult to really define or determine the full effects of one individual's activities. Nevertheless, if we just take a couple of examples, in your gathering there may be a number of Western lamas trained in the Kagyu and Yuma tradition. That would mean trained primarily through going through the three-year retreat contemplative training process. And it's not at all sure that there would be such thing as Western lamas trained in that way had Kalu Rinpoche not established the first three-year retreat for Westerners in the West, in France, in 1976. Among those of you who are trained in this way, no doubt many are lay practitioners, and some of you may also be women. This goes back to Kalu Rinpoche's decision, not without controversy, at the time of opening the doors of that training to lay practitioners as well as monastics, and to women as well as men, guaranteeing a parity of opportunity for men and women as well. If any of you have picked up translations, you may have read some translations of Longchenpa's Treasuries or the Treasury of Knowledge. You may even have picked up your iPad and studied the Treasury of Knowledge with the new interactive application. All of this and many other books, if you've read books by Sarah Harding, Elizabeth Callahan, Richard Barron, Noam Thompson, all of these are works of students of Kalu Rinpoche, those trained through the kindness of Kalu Rinpoche, and expressing that appreciation of the importance of combining study and practice in aiding the flourishing of an understanding of the Buddhist path of awakening. Another example, you're gathered for this Monlam, this gathering of aspirations, and it's most likely that your gathering was inspired by the many Monlam aspiration prayer gatherings that have been taking place over the last years. Many of those, if not all of those, inspired by the Kagyu Monlam, which began in the mid-80s when Kalu Rinpoche decided to take his monastery on pilgrimage and to spend some time at Bodh under the Bodhi tree, doing prayers of aspiration. Kalu Rinpoche was an individual who felt that intention and aspiration were extraordinarily important, that taking of his monastery became an annual event, which was then carried on by Bogor Rinpoche and became gradually known as the Kagyu Monlam, as other monasteries joined in, and has become then a great annual gathering in Bodh. And at this point in time, the number of groups and lineages and monasteries that go to Bodh on a regular basis to do their prayers is vast. I was there 2 years ago, and there was a continual competition for space under the Bodhi tree, the different groups doing their Monlam. So it shows how a simple decision can lead to very wide-ranging effects. Of course, there might be those in the Buddhist tradition who say, of course, such vast and impactful activity is natural for an awakened being, a Buddha. Those who refer to Kalu Rinpoche as Vajradhara or Dorje-chan Kalu Rinpoche. While I don't dispute that determination, for me the idea or the tendency in the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhist tradition, of elevating, sanctifying, and mystifying actually is not so useful, in the sense that of all the great teachers I've met, the great masters I've met, what I notice is their humanity, their simplicity, their directness, the lack of ostentation or of pretense. In fact, what makes them most recognizably awakened is their quality of reality. As human beings, I think we all embody our education and environment, and I would say Kalu Rinpoche very much embodied his education and environment growing up in 20th century Tibet, pre-diaspora Tibet. And yet there was something else that allowed the magic of his connection with his students, his Western students at the time, principally a very young crowd, that has more to do with the quality of his mind and spirit. So while all of us, as I mentioned, are an expression of or reflect our environment, our education, for the most fortunate individuals who are able to discover a path to that awakened quality of being, there then comes in that openness, lucid clarity, and freedom that comes from that state of mind, an ability to use relative form in whatever way is useful or effective. So using the vernacular of one's own education and experience to pursue a purpose that has more to do with awakening, being effective in inspiring and helping others become awakened, than in the form itself. And so while Kalu Rinpoche on an external level seemed to be venerable, elderly even at the time that he met his earliest Western students, and discreet, there was some quality within him that deeply touched everyone who met him in a transformative way, and inspired that relationship with his Western students that was to lead to this extraordinary activity in the West. In terms of his education then, Rinpoche grew up in Tibet and was very much associated with a life of retreat, contemplative training, practice. He was even born in a hermitage. His father was a tulku and a lama trained in the Shampa tradition under Jangpa Kongtrul Lodrötai, having completed his 3-year retreat training at Kongtrul's Hermitage and Retreat Center at Sandra Rinchen. Kalu Rinpoche was born in a hermitage high on a hillside overlooking the Rangpatsa Valley, a very fertile, rich valley in eastern Tibet in Kham. In fact, the hermitage where Kalu Rinpoche was born was just across the valley from the birthplace of the third Karmapa Ronchen Dorje. When he was a young boy, Kalu Rinpoche spent some time in a small monastery, and it said that he was a precocious learner, and even before the age of 15 was giving public lectures on the 3 levels of vows. At 16, Kalu Rinpoche set off himself to Tsadar Rinchen Trak to seek entry into the 3-year retreat. And that was where he met his principal teacher of the Shampa lineage, Nobu Dundrup, who was the retreat master of the Tsadar Rinchen Trak Retreat Center. And in the Shampa tradition, the main protector is the 6-armed Mahakala Shadrupa, and the story goes that each lineage holder, when they're about to meet their successor, is given some indication or premonition by Shadrupa, 6-armed Mahakala. And so it was one day, Nobu Dundrup told his attendants, tomorrow someone very important is going to be coming to see me, so even though I'm in retreat and not seeing anyone, whoever comes tomorrow, please show them in to see me. The next day passed, and no one was shown in. And at the end of the day, Nobu Dundrup spoke to his attendants and said, did no one turn up? He was very surprised since he had expected someone to turn up. And no one had turned up, and they both said, no one had turned up, no one of any interest turned up. And he said, are you sure? Absolutely no one came to the door today. He said, oh, there was just this young 16-year-old with his yak looking into the possibility of doing a retreat, but we turned him away. Nobu Dundrup said to his attendants, please go and find him and bring him to me, and that was Kalu Rinpoche. And that was his meeting with Nobu Dundrup. Nobu Dundrup gave Kalu Rinpoche the full transmission of the Shampa cycle. Kalu Rinpoche entered retreat, completed his 3-year retreat at Sandra, and then went back to his home valley, where he spent about 12 years studying and practicing in normal circumstances. And then, at about the age 29, Kalu Rinpoche decided that he felt it was essential for him to go into a period of long solitary retreat, and left to pursue this retreat on his own for a period that turned out to be about 12 years. And in describing this time, Kalu Rinpoche would say that he would not stay in one place more than 1 or 2 years so as not to become too comfortable and too attached. And he described to me some of the circumstances where he spent time in retreat. He talked about one secluded valley with fields and a small wooden cabin, and at that time he had the company of a horse. Another time he spent time in retreat where his retreat place was under a rock overhang, so quite exposed to the elements. Yet another time he was in retreat high in a cave overlooking a glacier. So all of these different places he spent in retreat. After this 12-year period, word came from his teacher Siddha Rinpoche, responsible for the Palpong monastic domain, of which Sadra Comptrol Hermitage was a part, requesting that he come back and take over the role as retreat master of the Tsadar Rinchen Trak Retreat Center. Kalu Rinpoche refused several times, and then when his teacher Siddha Rinpoche said if he did not accept this appointment, then he need never address the speech to Siddha Rinpoche again. Finally, Siddha Rinpoche's insistence, Kalu Rinpoche accepted, returned, and took his position at Sadra as the retreat master. At that time, there was some contention in Palpong among other lamas, wondering why they were bringing an outsider in to take this position. And it was at that point that Siddha Rinpoche and Karmapa, the 15th Karmapa, both expressed the fact that Kalu Rinpoche was, in fact, the unrecognized 5th incarnation of Jamgon Kongtrul Lodrötai, the activity incarnation, but to recognize him would reduce his activity and shorten his life. In fact, Kalu Rinpoche's father's decision to protect him when various monasteries wanted to recognize him as a reincarnate teacher, a toku, and his father's refusal, saying that he preferred to educate his son himself, protected Kalu Rinpoche from the role of a toku, which in Tibet at the time implied administrative responsibilities and a lot of fundraising responsibilities. And so it was through his father's decision that Kalu Rinpoche was protected and was able to dedicate his life to practice the way he did. After leading several retreats, after renovating the Sayadaw Retreat Center, which when he did his own retreat and when he arrived, was big enough for 4 meditators, 1 individual practicing Mahakala all day long, and 1 attendant, a small community of 6 in this retreat center. Under Kalu Rinpoche's direction, Sayadaw was renovated and grew to be able to house 25 or 26 retreatants. During the Cultural Revolution, much of Sayadaw was destroyed and was then rebuilt, and today it's continuing as a retreat center again in this larger size with 25 or 27 retreatants in retreat, etc. In the early or mid-50s, the political situation was deteriorating. Kalu Rinpoche made his way to Lhasa to discuss with Karmapa, 16th Karmapa at that point, what might be the wise path to follow. And at that point in Lhasa, he received an invitation from Queen Mother of Bhutan to visit Bhutan and take charge of a small monastery there, which Kalu Rinpoche did. So Kalu Rinpoche left Tibet in 1956 before it was necessary to flee the Chinese. From Bhutan, he moved to Darjeeling briefly and then established his small monastery in Sonada, about 10 miles down the road from Darjeeling. And so it was during the 60s in Sonada that Kalu Rinpoche started to meet these Westerners, young Westerners traveling in India. And so the connection, again, was perhaps a curious one, this seemingly traditional Lama and these somewhat eccentric Westerners traveling through India. One of Kalu Rinpoche's students at that point, an American, Richard Baldwin, who was in India with his wife Susan, that had their son Jesse. Richard talks about the fact that many Westerners traveling to India in the 60s were looking for freedom. In fact, they found the freedom to die anywhere, anytime, without anyone caring. In fact, it is more likely that the Westerners were actually seeking some quality of authenticity, of meaningfulness, quality of freedom in a deep inner sense that comes with awakening without really knowing what they were seeking. And this connected very directly with Kalu Rinpoche's spirit of openness and some free spirit that was very much a part of his character. The meetings of Kalu Rinpoche and these students led eventually to Kalu Rinpoche traveling to the West at the encouragement of His Holiness Karmapa to explore and discover whether there was fertile ground in the West for Buddhism, for Tibetan Buddhism, for these teachings of awakening. And Kalu Rinpoche traveled to the West, and in the Rimay, an ecumenical sense that you're all celebrating in your gathering, when he came to the West, Kalu Rinpoche first went to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, to pay his respects to the spiritual sources of the Western religious traditions, made his way to Rome and met with the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Paul VI at the time, and then traveled briefly through Paris to North America, where he was hosted privately in Toronto, Minneapolis, in Berkeley, and finally made his way to Vancouver in the spring of 1972. Now, Kalu Rinpoche had looked into the matter and felt that the best place for his activity to develop and flourish was Canada. And so in the spring of 1972, he spent a number of weeks taught students who had followed him or who had gathered there, and finally established a center for the study and practice of Buddhism. Now, it's interesting if one thinks about the situation at the time. This is the early 70s. Most of the students were young hippies or ex-hippies. It was quite a wild time. Most of us had a great suspicion of those of a certain age and of the establishment. While Kalu Rinpoche, in a certain sense himself, was, to all appearances, in the Tibetan context, a conservative figure, and for all of us, of course, he was very exotic, and that free spirit in his mind connected very directly. In fact, it was interesting when Westerners would come to initial teachings. Of course, Kalu Rinpoche was known to not hesitate from teaching traditional matter, going into great detail in the hot and cold hells. And yet every teaching would begin with direct pointing out the nature of mind. He would always begin every teaching talking about the openness, the lucid clarity of mind, and the unimpeded freedom of creative expression of mind. And if students could hear on some level, intuitively, or appreciate that quality of freedom that was being conveyed, then the rest of the teaching became relative form that was less solid and concrete. And these students tended to stay, whereas those who could not hear that essential teaching would often get caught and stumble on the solidity of the more traditional form that was being expressed. In any case, at this time, Kalu Rinpoche would surprise us often. And in fact, while we were wild in a certain sense, we were taking our spirituality very seriously. And so there would be occasions where, for instance, Kalu Rinpoche would receive someone in his room. He'd be sitting on his bed, and this venerable, respectable Lama, and the students would come in, or the student would come in, and Rinpoche would offer them the seat on a Tibetan carpet on the floor in front of him, without the student knowing that before they're coming into the room, he had set up the Tibetan carpet with a whoopee cushion and was just waiting for the whoopee cushion to go off and to break the ice for the beginning of the interview or the meeting. Yet another occasion, he had been given a small laugh box, this laugh box, which at a flick of a switch would give off insane, crazy laughter. And I remember the last interview I had with him before he left to go back to India, we had talked about a number of things, of course very serious meditation experiences, dreams, and so on that I'd been having. Also, she gave me a very profound pointing out instruction at that time, which remains with me to this day. So it was a very meaningful meeting, but just so that I didn't take myself and the whole meeting too seriously, as the curtain fell behind me, the door curtain fell behind me as I left the room, what followed me out of the room was the crazy, insane laughter of the laugh box. But nevertheless, he thought enough of the integrity and the sincerity and the commitment of these Western students to create this center. And in a certain sense, this became the petri dish, the beginning of his experiment with what might be possible with the West and with Westerners. He gave us two tasks, which was to learn Tibetan and to complete our preliminary practices of the 400,000s. And then he left assuring us if we studied and practiced well, he would be back in 6 months. An interesting note to think about is that the average age of the board of directors of this Kalu Rinpoche's first Buddhist center in the West, what was the beginning of this grand experiment of his activity in the development of Buddhism in the West, the average age of the board of directors was 23. So as most of us, or many of us, are well on in life, to think of the trust that he placed in us and some connection between that kind of fearless, open-minded, freedom and integrity of youth that connected to some similar qualities in Rinpoche's mind, his free spirit, his curiosity, and his openness to possibilities. Rinpoche came back 2 years later to see how his experiment had fared. Now, in the meantime, there was another great Lama who I think you've celebrated in an earlier meeting, the wonderful, extraordinary Dejun Rinpoche, who lived in Seattle. Dejun Rinpoche had arrived in the early 60s in Seattle, one of the greatest scholars of his generation, an extraordinary Lama, tutor to the Poso Podang family of the Sakya lineage. And Dejun Rinpoche had been a resource person for scholars and academics at the University of Washington through the 60s, and had a number of academics as students. Some of them went on to have very illustrious careers. And yet, in the spring of 1972, he heard that this Lama Kalu Rinpoche had arrived in Vancouver, spent several weeks teaching, had created a center for the study and practice of Buddhism, and had left 30 or 40 young Westerners in their 20s, all beginning to study Tibetan and engaged in doing their 100,000 prostrations. And Dejun Rinpoche thought this was really very extraordinary. And he determined that he wanted to meet Kalu Rinpoche and would do everything he could to help this budding community of practitioners. At the same time, the Vancouver Center became aware of Dejun Rinpoche, reached out to him, invited him, and every 6 months, Dejun Rinpoche would visit the Vancouver Center. And yet, as another example of the extraordinary Rimay quality, Dejun Rinpoche refused for many years to teach anything but Kagyu teachings at what was the Kagyu Center at that time. And so it was when Kalu Rinpoche came back in 1974, his second visit to the West. The timing was set up so that he would be in Vancouver to receive His Holiness the 16th Karmapa, who was making his first trip to the West. And Dejun Rinpoche also came to Vancouver at that time at the invitation of the Vancouver Center to be there, to be present, and to meet Kalu Rinpoche. What's important about that meeting, aside from another deep friendship that Kalu Rinpoche developed with lamas and great teachers of other traditions, already being a very close friend to Chado Rinpoche and to Nigur Chense Rinpoche of the Nyima school in India. At this meeting, Dejun Rinpoche requested Kalu Rinpoche for the transmission of the Shampa cycle of teachings and practices. Now, at that point, Kalu Rinpoche had been presenting himself primarily as a Kagyu Lama, and it was only later, when many of us went into retreat, that we discovered that his true practice identity was principally as a Shampa practitioner and the head of the Shampa lineage, while of course he practiced and held both the Kami Kagyu and Shampa Kagyu traditions. The essence of his principal practice tradition was the Shampa being a lineage primarily of meditators, of yogis, who, whenever possible, avoid institutions, often running away from responsibility for monasteries in order to pursue practice quietly in isolated or retreat situation. The Shampa tradition, which was originally inspired by the teachings of two females, Nigama and Sukhasiddhi, and while the Shampa tradition was given form by a monk, Chompo Naljor, the essence of the practice and teachings very much carried a certain quality of depth and subtlety and precision that seemed to come from that feminine inspiration at its origin. So Deshe Rinpoche had heard about the Shampa tradition, knew that Kalu Rinpoche was the lineage holder for the Shampa tradition, and requested this transmission. Kalu Rinpoche and Deshe Rinpoche arranged to meet in Vancouver several months later in the early months of 1975, where Kalu Rinpoche gave Deshe Rinpoche this transmission, a series of approximately 40 empowerments and reading transmissions that takes 2 to 3 weeks. This is the first time that transmission was given outside of Asia, and it was during this transmission where Kalu Rinpoche had allowed those of his Western students who had completed their preliminary practices to participate in the transmission. It was during this set of transmissions that Kalu Rinpoche first came up with the idea and the proposal of establishing a 3-year retreat in the West for his Western students. At this point, for most of us, the idea of a 3-year retreat had nothing to do with the institution or the idea of becoming a lama or any kind of recognition coming out of the process. It was simply another way to pursue our practice further. And in fact, when Kalu Rinpoche ever spoke of the 3-year retreat, again, it was not in terms of any institutional function, but it was as a path to freedom and independence, a path of empowerment. He would say that by going through the training of a 3-year retreat, we would be fully equipped and have everything we needed to pursue a life of contemplative discipline and practice, completely independently. So this idea began to take shape. At the same time, Kalu Rinpoche was, it seems, convinced that this Buddhist center that he had created had been somewhat successful, so went about creating centers in 1974 in the United States, San Francisco, New York, perhaps Hawaii, in France, in Paris, and in Burgundy, and continued in every trip after that to create other centers, to the point where at the end of his life he created over 60 centers. We were called to meet Kalu Rinpoche 2 years later in 1976 in France, and Rinpoche spent 6 months with us as we built the first retreat center that was at this center in Burgundy that he had established a couple of years previously. And we found ourselves at the end of 1976, a group of 7 men and 7 women in this retreat center, cloistered, going through the different levels of training. And at that point, this seemed very normal and natural. We're just simply following the instructions of our teacher, and we had no idea what a radical decision this was on the part of Kalu Rinpoche, opening this Pandora's box of the full depth and extent of his tradition, transmitting that fully and totally to his Western students in a context where this also became empowerment and transmission. As Rinpoche had done with his first center, experimenting in one case and then establishing many, so it was with the retreat center, having experimented with this one, deciding that it seemed to have worked somewhat, then Kalu Rinpoche went about creating other retreat centers. And lamas of other traditions who have been watching this experiment closely. And I have to say there were, of course, not just Kalu Rinpoche, but there were a number of great teachers of different traditions who also had great trust in Western students and were willing to encourage this whole process. And so there were other retreat centers created. I know for a fact the 16th Karmapa was very keen on this whole process. Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche, who had established a Nyingmapa center in the Dordogne region of France, created also a retreat center. And Kalu Rinpoche's activity continued to explore other ways of benefiting the West. Kalu Rinpoche, as holder of the Shampa lineage, was also holder of the Jonan Kalachakra tradition. And there was a period in his later years where he spent a great deal of time giving the Kalachakra empowerment in many different places around the world. But also, in the years of Tibetan Buddhism developing in its centers in the West, there became more and more of a desire and a wish and a request that individuals be able to practice in their own language. And Kalu Rinpoche felt that among his students, he had a number of students who were both accomplished in the Tibetan language and had established a contemplative training basis of experience, and that this group would be ideal for moving forward this ability for individuals to be able to practice in their own language, and not just practice, but study and to develop deeper understanding. So we see that Kalu Rinpoche's presence, his activity with all of his Buddhist centers, with over a dozen 3-year retreat centers created around the world, with all of the translation efforts, the values of the importance of practice and study, and the understanding that what is important is the essence of the practice, the process of awakening. All of these values have continued to spread and to percolate and to affect the environment of Tibetan Buddhism developing in the West. I don't think it would be complete to talk about the legacy of Kalu Rinpoche without talking about his most recent gift to us, in a certain sense, the Yongsi Kalu Rinpoche, the second Kalu Rinpoche. It's been interesting, to see that the Kalu Rinpoche, Yongsi Kalu Rinpoche, has connected to a whole generation of 20-somethings. In a sense, is very much a form or an expression that connects with his own generation. And while the previous Kalu Rinpoche, first Kalu Rinpoche, was older when we met him, his mind was very youthful and he connected directly to the community of 20-somethings in their aspirations, their needs, and their apprehensions. So the young Kalu Rinpoche is connecting very directly to the generation, his own generation. The King of Bhutan asks him often to address the youth of Bhutan, who seem to be quite lost in terms of Buddhism and Dharma. Wherever he goes, or with the modern media, Kalu Rinpoche connects to the youth. Whatever else was going on in terms of form, structure, teaching, what was the essential point, it seemed, at any given moment, was to establish a significant connection, to make every encounter meaningful. I remember myself and other of my friends and colleagues noticing so often that anytime Kalu Rinpoche met an individual, that individual would leave the meeting with something, a phrase, a word, a comment, an insight, having been touched in a way profoundly, deeply, transformatively, having been given an element or a tool that would serve them for their whole lives, whatever else happened. Aside from form, aside from structure, aside from tradition, the encounter between Kalu Rinpoche and the student would provide something that would be meaningful and transformative. And watching the Yongsi Kalu Rinpoche and his activity, Kalu Rinpoche's intention and his effective activity is using each encounter with each individual as something that becomes meaningful and transformative. So in terms of the activity, the legacy of Kalu Rinpoche, just as was our experience with the previous Kalu Rinpoche, what I would have to say is fasten your seatbelts. It's just beginning. Thank you.
We had some other contributions from lamas, not as video, but as letters or notes that they wrote about Kalu Rinpoche, their connections with him. So I'll just read those to you. They're quite short. One is a message from Lama Norla on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the parinirvana of Dorje Chang Kalu Rinpoche. He says, I am very happy that the Rimay Monlam is honoring the life of Dorje Chang Kalu Rinpoche and sharing recollections of his inconceivable kindness and inspiring example. Dorje Chang Kalu Rinpoche's love and care for sentient beings was profound and pervasive. He prayed earnestly to be able to help sentient beings and, inspired by bodhicitta, diligently meditated for more than 12 years in solitary mountain retreats. Attaining full enlightenment, he was able to realize the fruit of his aspirations to help all sentient beings. Master of the Shangpa and Karma Kagyu traditions, Dorje Chang Kalu Rinpoche was truly non-sectarian, studying and practicing under the guidance of the great lamas of all four lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And because of Kalu Rinpoche's indisputable realization and accomplishment in meditation, masters and practitioners of all four lineages regularly requested teachings, empowerments, and blessings from him. Dorje Chang Kalu Rinpoche was one of the first and foremost lamas to bring Tibetan Buddhism to the West, founding practice and retreat centers all over the world, especially the traditional 3-year retreat facilities that introduced serious practitioners to the depth and breadth of a full range of Vajrayana practices. As a result of his efforts to bring authentic practice opportunities equally to all, many people worldwide received the training needed to become qualified lamas. At the same time, Rinpoche planted seeds of wisdom in practitioners of all levels with his profound but clear teachings on the nature of mind and the meaning of meditation, and spread the blessings of the Buddha's compassion by propagating the practice of Chenrezik in all of his centers. By recognizing and remembering Kalu Rinpoche's immense kindness, we are inspired to follow his example. And in following his example, we move closer to realizing the ultimate benefit for both ourselves and others, the state of enlightenment and the power to guide sentient beings on the path to freedom. I would like to recollect the following notable story from Kalu Rinpoche's life. After completing his 3-year retreat at Palpung Monastery, in which he practiced with unwavering diligence, Kalu Rinpoche began to have many dreams in which he visited Pure Lands and received teachings from Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. When he described these experiences to his root Lama Norbudunrup, his teacher showed little interest, telling him plainly that dreams are just an illusion, neither good nor bad, explaining, these dreams are experiences that arise in practice, but the important point is to meditate and realize your own mind as Mahamudra. Dreams will never be the cause of enlightenment. Deeply inspired by these words, Kalu Rinpoche resolved to turn away completely from worldly concerns and dedicate himself to accomplishing perfect enlightenment. At age 25, he departed for an extended retreat in the desolate mountains of Kham, wandering without possessions, taking shelter in caves and under cliffs, seeking and needing no human company. He intended to spend the rest of his life in solitude. He was truly a second Milarepa, an extraordinary example of a genuine yogi without a hair's tip of interest in samsaric pursuits. Kalu Rinpoche left his mountain retreat only upon the order of Sita Rinpoche, who recognized that it would benefit beings greatly for him to return and teach the Dharma. He fully dedicated the rest of his life to the Buddha's teachings and to sentient beings, and is thus an extraordinary example of a true bodhisattva whose body, speech, and mind were moved by selfless love and compassion for all beings without exception. May we all follow the unsurpassable example of Dorji Chung, Kalu Rinpoche, rejoicing in your virtue, Lama Norla. Next, we have a letter from Ken MacLeod. Lama Drupju, we saw last on the video, was one of the 7 people in that original 3-year, 7 men and 7 women in the original 3-year retreat in France. Another was Ken MacLeod. Another was Richard Barron, Choki Nyima, the translator of Longchenpa's Dzudun, and so forth. So Ken MacLeod was there. And Ken MacLeod says, Kalu Rinpoche was my principal teacher. While I studied with a number of other teachers, it was from Kalu Rinpoche that I received the vow of refuge, the bodhisattva vow, Vajrayana empowerment, and much more. In particular, it was he who, both through his teaching and his example, taught me about the Rimay approach to study and practice, an approach that I have held close to my heart throughout the years, and one which I have sought to inspire or instill in those who have seen fit to work with me as their teacher. Rimay is an approach, not a tradition, and the difference here was vitally important to Kalu Rinpoche and the originators of the Rimay idea, Jamgon Kongtrul, Chenze Wangpo, and Za Paltrul. In a culture whose ethic of tribal loyalty often found problematic expression in the regard people had for their own traditions, Kalu Rinpoche consistently extolled the value and the genius not only of the many traditions of Buddhism in Tibet, but other Buddhist traditions and indeed other religious traditions. In his autobiography, he encouraged us to have great faith and devotion for our own tradition of practice, but not to let that devotion turn into fanaticism, partisanship, or sectarian prejudice. Whatever tradition we follow or practice, we naturally and rightly feel that it is the best, but the point that Kalu Rinpoche emphasized is that our chosen tradition is the best for us, and that another person rightly feels that their path of practice is the best for them. Rinpoche's message here is particularly appropriate in this postmodern age where we live in a pluralistic society with many cultures, traditions, and philosophies. He always encouraged people to find a path of practice and go deeply within it, while maintaining respect and appreciation for other paths. He never felt that sampling or taking a bit from here and a bit from there was fruitful. To illustrate this point, he used to describe a breakfast that we had on the road on his first trip to North America in 1972. In front of him, he had a glass of water, a glass of orange juice, a cup of tea, and a cup of coffee. Someone then came up and offered him hot chocolate, and I think a couple of other fruit juices. All of these were tasty and nutritious drinks, well, maybe, he would say, but they would taste pretty awful if you mixed them all together. Thus, on this occasion of the prayer service inspired by the Rimay approach developed in 19th century Tibet, let us each drink deeply and be nourished by our respective traditions, recall the extraordinary kindness of our teachers, and carry their words in our hearts in everything we do. With best wishes to you all, Ken MacLeod. And finally, from Jetsun Matenzin Palmo, who Lama Shenpen Hukam mentioned, she received Damgak Zu with in Dalhousie, India, from Kalu Rinpoche. I should just mention before I forget that Damgak Zu, those months of empowerments that they received, Kalu Rinpoche going blah, 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 blah. That's one of the 5 great treasuries or collected treasures of Dharma teachings put together by Jamgon Kongtrul Lodru Tai, and in particular that treasury is 18 volumes of collected, codified, and formal meditation instructions on different practices from masters of all of the different traditions, Tibetan Buddhism. So a letter from Jetsun Matenzin Palmo, which she addressed to me, my dear Tuku Sherdor. Below are a few words on my encounters with Kalu Rinpoche in the early days. I hope that this is suitable. Good luck with your Rimay Monlam. All good wishes in the Dharma. The year is 1964, and the place is a small Himalayan hill town called Dalhousie, where I was working at the young Lama's home school, a small school set up by an Englishwoman named Frida Bidi to teach English to young tulkus. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Akong Rinpoche, Tartang Rinpoche, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche were among the many lamas who passed through this unique school. Frida, later Bhikshuni Kechok Palmo, had invited Kalu Rinpoche to give the transmission for the 6 yogas of Nguma, the Shangpa teaching, to the nuns of the small Karmakagyu nunnery she had also established. At that time, Kalu Rinpoche was not well known, but he was already dedicated to reviving the Shangpa Kagyu lineage. During the day, for 1 week, Rinpoche bestowed empowerments and oral transmissions to the nuns. And then in the evening, he again gave the wongs to our small group, comprising Frida, Jane Werner, the writer John Blofeld, and myself, who had recently received ordination from my Lama Kamtrul Rinpoche. This was the first real empowerment I had ever received, apart from long life empowerments, and we were very ignorant. Tutop Toku, a Sakya Lama, was our translator. Kalu Rinpoche would mention seeing ourselves as Dorje Pamo, Vajrayogini, and we would look blank. Go and bring a tanka of Dorje Pamo so we could see what she looked like. It was all done very carefully with all the visualizations explained. Such patience and kindness. A few years later, Kalu Rinpoche again came to Dalhousie, this time to give the Damgak Zu of Kongtrul Rinpoche, which took about 3 months. This was again a small affair with maybe 80 Tibetan monks and nuns and a handful of Westerners. We were very fortunate to have such an intimate setting in which to receive this transmission. At all times, Kalu Rinpoche was compassionate and calm with us and gently humorous. It was a great blessing to be in the presence of such a master. Later, of course, as his fame grew, Kalu Rinpoche traveled around the world and inspired thousands of people. But I only saw him during this early period when he was already working so hard to spread the Dharma and keep alive the precious lineages which he held. Tenzin Palmo. So Lama Drupchu, who was also the first, he doesn't mention this, Lama Drupchu was the first Western retreat master because he was the teacher of the Salt Spring Island 3-year retreat after having completed it once or twice, I don't remember. Lama Drupchu mentioned Kalu Rinpoche's activities to spread the Dharma in unconventional ways in untested, uncharted waters. Reminded me of one story when I was at one of those centers that sprang up from that experiment in France. Kalu Rinpoche started a 3-year retreat here nearby in Wappingers Falls, New York. First retreat was in 1982, and I had just come back from my first trip to Asia, and so had met Kalu Rinpoche at the Karmapa's cremation in Rumtek Monastery, was inspired by him and heard he was giving empowerments in New York right as soon as I got back, so I went to those empowerments, which you mentioned, January 1982. And then he was establishing a 3-year retreat upstate here, starting in 1982. So I was in school nearby and was going on weekends and getting as many empowerments as I could. And then again, I received all of the empowerments and transmissions from him, Karma Kagyu, Shangpa Kagyu, in 1986 before my own retreat, which he came in and put us in retreat personally. And I had been living in a small Drikong Kagyu center in Washington, D.C. before moving to New York to train for the 3-year retreat, and became good friends with a Nigerian doctor who was working at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, Samuel Adeni Jones. And he had this kind of like intuitive grasp about the nature of mind. He was a really special person, very sharp. And so he was always asking me, what is this thing that you're going to do in New York, this 3-year retreat, what is it about? And so after months of training and preparing and Kalu Rinpoche giving empowerments, I called him and I said, you should just come and meet Kalu Rinpoche yourself, then I don't have to explain it. See what it is like to be with someone like that. So he came, and I brought him in for a personal interview with Kalu Rinpoche. And the moment he walked in the door, this elegant gentleman, doctor, very dignified, he started to just tremble from head to toe because of the compassion energy from Kalu Rinpoche. And I had become a little bit inoculated or something because I'd spent so much time around him. I didn't have that reaction, but I understood it, and so he did his prostrations and he was shaking, and then he said, in our country, in Nigeria, we have no Dharma, we have a lot of witchcraft and black magic and sorcery, and it's a very primitive place, and I fear for my people, and I wish there was some way to help them with the Dharma as well. And Kalu Rinpoche said, you can do a 3-year retreat at any of my centers anywhere in the world, and I will be your sponsor. And when you've done it, then you can bring me to Nigeria, and I will do my best. Just immediately, no hesitation. You want to, okay, let's go to Africa. Just like that. That was Kalu Rinpoche. And then we had heard briefly from people about his friendships with lamas of other lineages, and one was Chadro Rinpoche Sanjay Dorje, who actually lived nearby in Gum Monastery, just nearby Sonada. And I remember in 1983, waiting for the arrival of Chadro Rinpoche, who was coming to visit Kalu Rinpoche, and Kalu Rinpoche came down to the road and met him at his car, and holding hands, they walked up the hill together to the house to have lunch, And I heard a story later, I think it was from Chokyi Nyima Rinpoche, who gave an example of the quality of their friendship and deep mutual respect without any kind of judgment or boundaries. And it was that Kalu Rinpoche was the very dignified, frail, monastic renunciate, but he ate meat. Chadro Rinpoche was the lay, yogi, voluble, opinionated, brash, wild yogi, but he was strictly vegetarian. But when they had lunch together, Kalu Rinpoche would be served his meat, Chadro Rinpoche would be served his veggies, and then they would help serve each other. Aww. They would feed each other. So I thought that was a very touching story. And then just one last story that many of you have heard from me, but some of you may have not. It was about this point that Lama Drupche made about trying to have a real lasting impact with each encounter, with each person whom he ever met. And this is, in my life experience, the perfect illustration of that I have a late friend, Richard Marshall, on whose land I did my year-long solitary retreat, also up in this area. And Richard was a very brilliant but down-to-earth Yorkshireman. It's kind of intellectual and very working class at the same time. And he had this friend named George. And Richard told me this story about his friend George and Kalu Rinpoche's first visit to New York, where George came to my friend Richard and was looking very pale and exhausted with big bags under his eyes and very kind of nervous and upset. And Richard said, "What's wrong?" And he started to relate this whole series of events about something had begun to trouble his mind and he couldn't shake it. And the more he thought about it, the worse it became, and he just couldn't figure out any solution, and he couldn't sleep and he couldn't eat. And people had sent him for different therapies and different nutritional treatments and tell him to just go on vacation and not think about it. And he said, "I've tried everything and at my wit's end. I cannot go on like this." And Richard said, "You should meet Kalu Rinpoche." He said, "I'm not interested in Buddhism. I'm not interested in religion. I'm not interested in any of that. I've heard every possible idea. What could anyone possibly say to me at this point?" He's like, "You never know. It's your last resort, right? So give it a try." So he brought him to the center and arranged for a private interview, and George went up the stairs, very nervous with trepidation, thinking there was no point, he'd already given up, etc., etc. Maybe 7 minutes later, he came down, relaxed, face at ease, posture better, just his smiling for the first time in maybe months. And Richard said, "What happened?" He just told me. He said, "Just don't think about it." And of course, it wasn't the words, it was who had said them. And being in the presence of the who that made all the difference. It allowed something to open. So that was Kalu Rinpoche, and those are my contributions.
As you just told the story that I never heard before about Kalu Rinpoche, and really it was his best Lama friend, Chatrul Rinpoche, who's the oldest living Lama now. He's 103, I think. He's still alive. He has a white beard. If you've seen pictures of a Lama with a white beard, that's him, because Asians don't usually have beards like that. It's probably him. So he lived nearby to, his monastery was nearby, which in India means it's only an hour or two on the, it's 10 miles probably, but on the bumpy road there. And when Kalu Rinpoche passed, was on the way out, they called for Chatrul Rinpoche to come. And if you're familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, you know that Bardo Todol, the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Tibetan Book of Liberation in the Bardo through hearing, is a very important classic in all Latin, but they guide to guide those who have breathed their last and so on, died in English. So they called for Chatrul Rinpoche, the great old master, and it was in 1989. So Chatrul Rinpoche was younger then. He was only about 75 or 80, and in great shape as usual. And he came striding up the hill, and we were all at Dribgu, and the people you saw on that screen, we were in our translator's compartment of the monastery, kind of not working, just meditating while Kalu Rinpoche was passing away. And Chatrul Rinpoche came, and then the people who were in the Kalu Rinpoche's house, where Rinpoche was sitting, heard Chatrul Rinpoche's gruff voice in the room. Kalu Rinpoche was sitting up in Tugdam, post-death meditation, for a few days. And they heard Chatrul Rinpoche's voice. Of course, Chatrul Rinpoche didn't have to read from the book. He also didn't have to instruct Kalu Rinpoche. But they could hear Chatrul, and I don't know, I'm sure you've all been with the dying, the deceased in some time. Although in a hospital it could be very noisy, still when you have your chance with them and when you're at home or in the funeral home, it's very quiet. So we heard Chatrul Rinpoche's voice coming from the bedroom. Rah, rah, Rinpoche, Bardo, rah, rah, clear light, rah, rah, rah. Like Rinpoche must have been hard of hearing or something. Or else Chatrul Rinpoche was just hard of energy, of voice. It was like, rah, rah, rah. And I don't know what, telling him and shouting at him and, going, pit. Like with total, that's what he did with the energy to your friend's friend George. He said those same words that everybody else said, just don't think about it. But where he was coming from was what had the impact. So there was just so much energy or chi in that coming out of that room. We could all hear it. It was pretty funny. And we had been quiet for days while Rinpoche was in his last days and minutes.
How did it make you feel when that energy came out?
Great.
How did you guys react?
Well, everybody has a different reaction. My reaction was like, wow. And I've been trying to be quiet for so many years. It's not me. And some of the other people who were way more scholarly than me, I was like the mascot of the translation committee. They wanted to know what he was saying. And could anybody hear the words? And let's write them down. Everybody had a different reaction. But the amazing thing was this, that I'm not much with the miracle stories. If you've heard me teach or you read my books, I don't tell that many miracle stories. And this isn't a miracle story, but this is true. I don't know, there must have been 100 people in that monastery, and it's a refugee monastery. It's a chaotic place next to a train tracks. It's not a quiet place in the country like a spa here or a yoga ashram. Very noisy. But when Kalu Rinpoche was passing away, then everybody was very quiet and respectful. And when he died, and praying day and night for his long life and for other things, praying and being together in the spirit and seeking solace that way. When he died, then everything stopped. And there were no more prayers, there was no more ritual, there was no more daily schedule. For I think it was 3 or 4 days he sat in that Dharmakaya Buddha mind meditation with all Tugdam. And everything stopped. I mean, my mind stopped, and if that could stop anything, the world must have stopped. Everybody stopped. There were no lights being lit. There was no walking around the stupas. There was no Om Mani Padme Hum going on. There was no prayer wheels. There was no painting of the shrines and stupas. Everything just stopped. It was like his Buddha mind, his great peace, his great peace has took down, overawed our small minds. Everything just stopped. And nobody had to say, do or don't do the schedule or prayers. It was just everything stopped. And then when he came out of that, everything started again with preparations for ritual preservation, other things. So that's a little story about the master and his death and post-death meditation. It's called Tugdam. You can Google it.
There was one other little story about, you've heard reference to calling him Dorje Chang Kalu Rinpoche or Vajradhara Kalu Rinpoche. Might wonder how that started. So here's how it started. At one point, he was giving the Rinchen Terzut, another one of these 5 great treasuries of Jamgon Kongtrul, in India to lineage holders, Tulkus Lamas from many different lineages, huge crowd, giving the precious treasury of treasure teachings, Rinchen Terzut. And there's a point at the beginning, after you give the history and so on, introductions, where you're supposed to say where your authorization came from to give the transmissions, where normally you say, I received it from the lineage holder so-and-so, and that person received it from such and such, and it's an unbroken, authentic lineage. And instead, he said, my authorization is that I have achieved the state of Vajradhara. Period.